time. It's our time, my friends. Time for millions of maturepreneurs, 55 plus, who are hashtag not done by a long shot, to revolutionize how we lead, do business, and innovate our world. I'm your host, Jeanette Anderson, and welcome to my conversations with fascinating people who would rather inspire than retire. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Maturepreneur podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a challenging but really important conversation. And I have with me today Dr. Rose Joudi. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Yes, you did.
Good, thank you. Who is an expert in elder abuse and who works in that field, who supports adults who are being abused, and who has a lot to say about how we can identify, see why it happens, and really bring it out of the shadows into the light so that we can ensure that this doesn't happen to those that we love or to ourselves. So welcome. I'm glad you're here today, Rose.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And so I'm going to tell you, as usual, her official bio. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, I'm Jeanette Anderson, your hostess with the mostest, and your Maturepreneur maverick. So I'll tell you her official bio, which is highly impressive, and then we'll find out the juicy, little known details behind the scene, and then we're going to launch into this topic. Now, if you have older parents, if you are planning on getting older, or if you're someone who just wants to be aware, perhaps works in the sector, this is a critical conversation for you to listen to. So, Dr. Rose Joudi, PhD in psychology, is a prominent researcher, consultant, and international speaker specializing in aging and ethnic diversity. She leads an ethnocultural elder abuse awareness project with CARIA in Calgary, Alberta, and teaches the psychology of aging at Mount Royal University. With extensive academic and research experience, Dr. Joudi addresses the unique needs of older adults in diverse populations. She promotes educational strategies on elder abuse awareness, ageism, trauma-informed care, cultural competence, and compassion. Formerly a board member of the Canadian Network for Prevention of Elder Abuse, she currently serves on the Alberta Association on Gerontology, the AAG board, and advises Alberta's Ministry of Seniors, Community, and Social Services. That's a lot. When do you sleep, woman? So, okay, as you can see, well qualified to talk about this, and obviously very passionate about the topic. So welcome. So how did you get into this? Before we get into the juicy tidbits behind the scenes, I'm just curious, what drew you to this work in the first place?
It's not a pretty topic, I have to say. However, it is an important one. And I really became passionate about it during COVID. It became one of those things that I was already addressing at the university level. However, I found that there was this huge curiosity from students that I was teaching online at that time, but also society in whole, about the impact of this unknown pandemic, this situation that just frazzled us as a society and a country and globally, and how that was really impacting the quality of life of older people and how we can continue to protect them, not just physically, but also from other elements that really impact their well-being, which actually includes being mistreated, neglected, and taken advantage of.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I would understand why there would be a rise in that as well during COVID, given all the stress, frustration, and isolation that was going on. So tell us something about you we wouldn't guess. So something that might surprise people reading that hefty bio or your website or any of your works that you've done. What's something about you most people don't know?
Most people actually don't know that I am from the Middle East. So I'm bilingual in Arabic and English. I was born in Baghdad, Iraq, but I had left when I was a child. And so I was raised in various parts of the country, including the UK, Libya, and New Zealand, in addition to the fact that now I reside in Canada.
Interesting. And you can hear, if you're good with accents, you can hear a little bit of each of those. The UK and the New Zealand still in there a little bit, but mostly the UK. So it's fascinating to try and figure out where you're from just from your accent. So and how long have you been in Canada?
Since 2007. So
Okay, so quite
yeah,
a while. All
close.
right. And what drew you here?
I met and married a Canadian, an Albertan. Yes.
Typical
That's
answer.
why I'm here.
From international people, that is almost always the answer. For love, I moved for love. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about your topic and some of the aspects of it. But before we go into that, what would you say is your purpose in general? So obviously, this became a passion in COVID, and you dive deeper into it. But what has been your purpose throughout your life?
My drive has always been, since I was a young, I would say maybe an undergrad at university, is to um, enhance the quality of life of individuals who would be considered vulnerable to elements that might impact their quality of life, but also their ability to live the best life they can. And so, as a postgrad student, I remember when I was finishing my degrees in New Zealand, I became really interested in the integration and settlement experiences of refugees who were coming into New Zealand at that time. And I worked with the government to explore whether or not the resources and support we had put in place actually met the needs of individuals who had experienced displacement, hardships, war, and what kind of resources and support they needed to live the best life they can, but also integrate into the New Zealand society and be effective citizens, really. And so that has always been my drive, is to advocate for people who would potentially be excluded in some situations and some aspects in society from integrating the best way they can, and looking at ways where we could provide that equitable access to supports and resources to all people.
Right. I think equity is a really important word. A lot of times we talk about equality, but that's not often that's not achievable. But equity is fairness and balance in some way. Um, so I suspect that your why goes back even further. My contention is that what we care about often is formed in childhood, and so I suspect you've probably long been an advocate for the unseen, the underdog, the how would I put it, those who are not, who are often overlooked, and it's important work. It's also very hard work to advocate for a lot of these people because you see a lot of suffering. How have you dealt for you personally with the heaviness of some of these topics and what you come across, and just in terms of, because before we go into the topic, how do people take care of themselves when they're dealing with heavy topics like this?
And you're absolutely right, Janet. It does, my interest and I guess my why is really embedded in the fact that I am an immigrant and a child of immigrants, individuals who were looking for better opportunities for their family, but spoke a different language, who had accents, for example, and came from backgrounds in which they had endured hardships. And so they're trying to build a new life, but also prove to the society that they have moved in, that they are of value and can give value, but also need the same resources and support that everybody else has. And so you're absolutely right. I opened my eyes to those challenges, and looking at the hardships that people within my community, for example, the Middle Eastern, Arabic speaking, Muslim communities, and the different challenges that they had to go through and continue to have to go through. And the stories that were told within the community gatherings, for example, about some struggles and hardships, for me were really impacted. Those experiences were really impactful on how I developed, but also what I wanted to do in order to better the experiences of those individuals and people who like them as well. So not necessarily people who just came from the same backgrounds as I did, but I found that people in general who differ linguistically and culturally do struggle considerably
Mm.
than those who are living in mainstream society. And yes, it can get a bit disheartening sometimes. You know, you do feel sad that you come across people who you know are good people and people who can provide value and people who do want to flourish and thrive just like everybody else, yet they come across barriers that I want to say others might not experience. And I think those are the situations and those are the things and stories that really drive that passion of mine in ensuring that no individual, regardless of their ethnic or linguistic background, should go through. But definitely the focus would be on people who tend to be, like you said, more vulnerable to those experiences because of the other factors that play a role in those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you really hit it on the head when you said that they are not valued for whatever the reason may be, whatever the justification or the prejudice may be. They're overlooked or dismissed. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about building the Maturepreneur world, because it is a whole sector of elders that are being overlooked, dismissed, undervalued. And frankly, it's not okay. It's just not okay. And it is in many ways, especially because many are economically disadvantaged or struggling. It is a form of abuse um, to have them be in that kind of situation and not be doing anything to alleviate it or support it. But before I co-opt the word, why don't you define for people what elder abuse is, so that it's an accurate description of it? What would you define abuse as?
So there are various definitions, including the one given by the World Health Organization, but the Government of Canada and the Government of Alberta also have definitions that tend to vary slightly, but they seem to all they're all similar in a sense that abuse is an action or an inaction that is harmful in various ways to a person. And usually when we say older adult, we are assuming 65 plus, which is the usual age category of an older adult. However, I would also err on the side of caution in clarifying as well that for some ethnically diverse communities, an older adult is a experience that is acquired by the time the person is about 50 or 50 plus, which is about 55, let's say. And so I think having that understanding also highlights the challenges sometimes that some ethnocultural communities face when particular resources and supports are only available if you are 65 plus, as
Yeah.
that is that's when you are considered an older adult. But it is, like I said, action or inaction to prevent harm towards an older adult, whether it's physical, financial, neglect, medication, sexual abuse as well, in addition to, of course, spiritual, religious forms of abuse, which also could include for some ethnocultural people social and cultural isolation, as well as sometimes it's unintentional neglect as well. Let's say that too. And so it's really any form of harm that's harming you physically, financially, emotionally, and psychologically as well.
Okay, that's pretty broad, and I think it's a good definition. It feels like a daunting field and a daunting thing to be looking after or looking for. So how can we identify mistreatment, or for ourselves or others? In many cases, a lot of the people listening to this are either older people themselves or the family of them, those who are perhaps older children who are taking care of older parents, that kind of thing. How do we identify mistreatment?
Before I actually go into that, I really appreciate the fact that you called it mistreatment, because I do want to also highlight that the term elder abuse in itself is becoming a bit more of a problematic, stigmatized conversation to have because of the label elder abuse. And so my hope is that with more conversations that I'm having with people like yourself who have a wide audience, as well as organizations and on a not-for-profit social impact agency level, but also government level, that we probably try and alter some of the terminologies that we're using in order for the door to remain open about having these healthy conversations. And so
Yeah.
when I talk about this topic in particular, I actually do talk about it from an angle of older adult mistreatment or older adult neglect, highlighting, of course, that unintentional neglect sometimes occurs in situations in which the family or the people who are looking after the individual, the older adult individual, do not have the education or awareness or the tools to assist that older person. So I really need to also point out that sometimes what we see from our Western lens as abusive might not be intentional. And I think rather than putting fear into that family or that person and coming at it from that punishing kind of lens, that we really have to be mindful and open to the reasons why some individuals are experiencing elder abuse. And so it's not to devalue this experience, because no one deserves and no one should be experiencing this form of mistreatment. But I think it's also important for us as a society to understand, are we really at fault as a society in whole that this is occurring because we are not educating and providing adequate tools for individuals in order for that not to happen? So
Yeah.
coming to the signs, like I said, it really is important for us to understand, what lens we're looking at these experiences from, whether it's something that the person is going through as a result of their full dependence on family members, or whether it is a result of the lack of education that is occurring in that kind of situation or context.
Mm. I would imagine, because as you were talking about the different kind of cultural diversity as well, that it's also further complicated by the fact that just like with parenting, so for some parents and cultures, corporal punishment, spankings, etc., is perfectly okay. In other situations and other cultures, it's not. And so we also have to take into account the lens that we're looking through to make sure that we're not bringing our, prejudices to
Absolutely.
the assessment of the situation, which makes it even more challenging, I would imagine. So coming back to identifying mistreatment, what are some of the signs? What are some ways to recognize the types of mistreatment that might be going on?
So it's, older adult mistreatment is one of those things and one of those topics that really people don't really necessarily always come forward and say that they're being abused. Now, in some cases, we do find that particular older adults from backgrounds in which English is a language that they use as a main language, and maybe they've been living in Canada for a longer period of time, so they're familiar with and comfortable and trusting of systems, they are probably more likely to maybe talk outwardly and say that they're being abused or mistreated. However, of course, the lower the education of the person's the more dependent they are on family members, the less trust they have towards resources and social impact agencies or officials, the less likely they are going to talk about being abused, especially if they don't perceive what is happening to them as abusive. And so again, going back to that lens, some people would look at the same thing, but will not label it or process it the same way. So mistreatment, of course, varies. Does the person, I mean, we're talking about it from that Western lens, however. So does the person look unkept? Are they losing weight, for example, from the past appointment or a visit of yours? Are they lacking in terms of adequate food, adequate care? Are their basic needs not met? Are they missing a lot of their appointments, for example? Are they not attending some events, whether they're social or cultural or religious, that in the past they perceived as very important? So there are really, really sometimes these subtle signs that could indicate that a person might be mistreated. And again, it's very important to investigate further as to what that is in particular, and whether it's intentional or not, and what resources might be adequate for that particular situation. So either the person will come outwardly and say that they're being mistreated or abused, or as a professional or as a neighbor or a community member, it's important to see whether or not there are things that are looking a bit off with that individual that you're usually familiar with, in terms of the other aspects, of course. Do they seem to be afraid of or uncomfortable talking in the presence of a particular family member, right? So it could be that that might be the individual who might be the potential perpetrator, and they don't feel comfortable talking to you in front of them.
Mm. So a lot of it is really just being present. And one of the things I know as a daughter, so the only caregiver for my mother, who had dementia and was in a variety of seniors homes, and my mother was difficult. That's a mild statement. She had 5 husbands for a reason, and um, uh, when she went into these homes, I was often extremely busy, didn't have a lot of time. She was often very angry. And so visiting her was not pleasant in any way. But had I not been present, I wouldn't have noticed a few of the signs that she was being abused. One of which was I arrived one time and her bed was soaked, and she had dementia and so was sometimes present, sometimes not. When I tried to understand why, what I pieced together from her roommate, from one of the nurses that would talk to me, is that to retaliate against her, because she was often very difficult, they would often not change her depends and or change her bed. So she would be lying in, her own feces or her own urine for hours and sometimes a whole night at a time. So of course, once I found that out, then all hell was broke loose on them, and that got remedied. But that continued with a subtle little thing, like I noticed she was really, really exhausted. When I asked her why she wasn't sleeping, it was because of the bugs. I was like, what bugs? There was little bubbles in the paint in the windowsill, and she thought they were bugs, and she thought she had bugs in her bed. She didn't, and no one could tell her that she didn't. So I had to work with the staff, and they basically said, well, there's nothing we can do. I got a spray bottle of water, put a label on it that said bug spray, had them spritz her room once a day, and she could sleep. So, but prior to that, she was not sleeping, which is, of course, very bad for mental health, because they wouldn't find a way to address the concern. Those are the kinds of things that are both intentional and neglectful. But I wouldn't have been able to protect her in that situation had I not been there and spent the time, which there were many times that I didn't, and overlooked things and missed things. So what I would really advocate, if you're listening to this, is being present, caring enough to look and listen. Even if they don't make sense, they're probably making sense in some way.
Absolutely. And I would also add to that, and thank you for sharing that. And it's heartbreaking really to hear that that had occurred. And I'm glad that it was looked into. I'd also add to that really is just to believe in them, believe what they say. It might not make sense sometimes, but when a person is not being treated well, in some way, in some form, they will be able to communicate that, and to believe them, and to reiterate that it's not their fault, and they don't deserve it, and no one deserves it, is very important as well. So being an advocate and definitely being present is very important.
Well, and I think particularly, I know again for my mom, and a concern I have is she felt like a burden, and frankly sometimes was, but also wasn't, right? It was challenging, but that didn't mean that she deserved to feel like she was not wanted, needed, and valued. So that really comes down to respect. How do we promote respect, especially for people who are often dismissed or undervalued? What are some ways to foster respect and dignity for older adults and all stages of life, but especially older adults?
That is a big societal question, and it needs a big societal approach, really. Um, Western society in general hasn't really done well in terms of valuing older adults in particular, or individuals that don't seem to be productive or to give value. And you see that, of course, with older individuals, for example, who at some point society says, well, now that you're not in the workforce, or now that you've got all those health conditions and challenges, you're not as youthful and healthy and able to give back to us. Let's segregate you and put you in these things that we call retirement homes so you can live the rest of your life there. Well, many people might not be living there with dignity. Maybe many people aren't living there with the care that should be given to them as part of their journeys as individuals within our society who were and continue to have value and be of value. And so this whole aspect of respect really starts from looking at the fabric of our society and seeing what is it as a society that we value and how do we talk about those things. To this day, you walk into particular stores and you will find at the birthday card section cards that are demeaning and devaluing and mocking of older individuals. Wherever those card racks are, and sometimes they're at the hospitals, at the universities, and at the local supermarkets. And you look at the way that we communicate with older adults and what we teach our professionals and healthcare professionals and how to communicate with older adults. Again, we're not really good at promoting this sense of value of all individuals, regardless of their chronological age or levels of abilities. And so it really starts with that. It starts with promoting and enhancing conversations about respecting all people, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of their abilities or their ages, and promoting those things in all avenues, whether it's a school, university, or our organizations and our systems, and to encourage training around that too, because you could be a healthcare professional, like you said, with your mum who was in a retirement home, where the expectation is that people who are working there are professionals who should be trained in knowing how to work effectively and respectfully with their residents, yet that wasn't the case. And so not bypassing these things and going, well, we'll just hire people because we need it is very important to consider. We need to hire and we need to promote the importance of respect for all people, but also having those conversations in which no one is undervalued because of how old they are. And you see that with the way that we communicate with older adults. There's a reason why we talk about infantilization and elder speech as well, especially in retirement communities and healthcare systems, who their clients or patients are older adults. We talk to older people like they're children, and they're not, and they shouldn't be treated as that, regardless of their cognitive capacities and abilities.
Absolutely. I think that's a really valuable point. And one of the things that I was thinking while you were talking is one of the challenges is that the abuse can go both ways, because there are times, and for many older people, they're angry. They're angry about how they're treated. They're angry about their situation. They're angry about the loss of their abilities. And they often can take that out on their caregivers, which then invites or creates or fosters that retaliation. And it becomes this cycle of anger. And so really understanding that we need to address all of it, all of the sides of it. And your other point that you mentioned about North American culture not being one that really values elders, I was thinking about the fact while you were talking, I was kind of going around the world in my head. Almost every other culture incorporates and values and in fact many honor their elders. Native American cultures, Occidental cultures, all sorts of cultures around the world. Most other cultures incorporate and include their older people in their families, in their homes, in so forth. We're one of the few places that don't. Why do you think that is? How did that come about? Or I know that's a big question, but is that something that we can shift in North America to become more like the rest of the world, that honors and includes elders?
I definitely don't want to be pessimistic and paint this in a doom and gloom kind of way, because I really also believe that since COVID, as a society, we are trying harder. We're trying to be better. And I think it's because we realized that the impact of whatever happened to us really didn't just affect the older adults themselves, but their families and our systems as well. And so I think that experience, in a way, was a really important learning experience for us. We realized we were not prepared to look after individuals who would need our assistance and our support. And we weren't really prepared to really understand that isolating older adults was probably not necessarily the best of options, because physically maybe we bubbled them. However, their mental health and well-being and their social interactions and their quality of life was impacted in different ways. So we really needed something like the COVID-19 pandemic to kind of shift our understanding of how we look at older adults in particular. And with that, actually, again, I think we are trying our best and we are hopefully doing better. And the reality is, in fact, that some cultures, even collectivist cultures that look at the values of the group and maintaining the harmony within the group, they're actually starting to change as well, interestingly enough. Research is now showing us that even countries like China and Japan has the largest number of centenarians, they're actually becoming less and less collectivist, and they are also seeing a rise in older adult mistreatment or elder abuse and neglect and abandonment, actually, as well. And the reason behind that, according to some researchers, is the influence of North American news, media, movies, social media, and all of those detrimental factors
Yeah.
on the societal systems of those countries. So even though we look up to these collectivist countries and cultures, they are unfortunately we're rubbing off on them in the wrong way,
Wrong way,
unfortunately.
yeah, no kidding.
Um,
Yeah, that's very unfortunate, very, very unfortunate. And particularly because there is such a large population there that are definitely older. Um, what can we do about this? So let's talk about empowering advocacy and how we can really practically support people in various ways. So how can we advocate and support people?
I say it's one of the easiest approaches, and I say yeah, but it's one of those easiest but not really easy approaches, but it is the one that makes the most sense, which is to have open conversations with the individuals that are being impacted by these kind of experiences or factors. And so having open conversations with older adults within our communities, within our society, about what is it that they need from us as a society in whole in order for them to thrive and to feel of value, and for them to share that conversation and share that information with us, and also understand, I guess, having those open conversations with them and having that communication with them is what we would refer to as more community-based conversations, which is, rather than assuming that we know what it is that they need from us, it shouldn't be like that. It should be more of, what is it that you need from us in order to enhance your quality of life and feel and continue to feel that you are individuals of value. So from a social psychology perspective, we know that historically, sitting with a group of people in which we already have stereotypes or predisposition beliefs about them is rectified and I guess clarified when you sit down with them and have conversations. And so if there's an us versus them conversation, which is unfortunate, but it's about us as a younger society and you as an older members of the society, when you sit down and have conversations with them, that conversation actually could help clarify some stereotypes and false beliefs that we have about each other. And so I think that whole intergenerational conversation is important, because there is that kind of interdependency. We need older adults in our society because they are individuals that have had the experiences and knowledges, and they continue to have value. But also older adults and older adult category groups, so the young old, 65 plus, and the mid old and the oldest old, they also do require some form of interdependence on us as well, and they have that too in terms of supports, and that's important to have as well. And so first and foremost, to have those open conversations, and then look at what we do have in terms of supports and resources put in place to ensure that all people are thriving in our society, and looking at whether or not some of those policies and best practices, as they might be called as well, are discriminatory and ageist. And in fact, maybe some way the wording of some of these policies and best practices and supports tend to lean towards a particular group than the other, and to address that and find ways to rectify that.
So I think the conversation component is really important, and I want to get really on the quarter practical with some of the ways to open those conversations. But one of the things you mentioned is getting more informed, and I think there's some like in terms, just in general terms about ageism, there are tons of resources. There's a blog that I love by Ashton Applewhite called "Yo, Is This Ageist?" And you can post questions about, hey, here's what happened, or here's what was said. Is that ageist? Reading that is quite fascinating, because it really is quite insidious, both in our own minds and how it gets played out in society, from, defaming birthday cards to just comments like, wow, you look really good for your age. That kind of thing is very subtle. So finding out more about ageism and how it plays out, I think, is very important. Oldschool.info is also a really good resource center for finding out information about ageism and ageism conversations, because I think becoming aware of the prejudices that we have is one of the first steps towards breaking down the us versus them. But what are some of you mentioned having, conversations. What are some of the questions that people could open with to understand? So let's start with, let's say, a general group of people, but then I also really want to find out, for instance, as a daughter of an aging parent or something like that, what are some of the things we should be asking them to really understand where they're at? But let's start with the understanding of kind of the intergenerational, breaking down those barriers. What are some conversations to have, some really like practical questions to ask each other?
It really will depend on the context, or the objectives of those conversations. Because again, it needs to be conversations that have intent and that are thought out. But also it could be conversations that you could just have with a family member as well. Like, how does it feel to be an 80-year-old in this day and age? Tell me about your dreams when you were my age, and did you achieve the goals that you wanted and hoped to achieve by the time you were 40, 60, and 70? So I think whatever the conversation, or however the conversations are constructed, it needs to be led with heart, non-judgmental, and be more curious about the person. Because again, this is your future self, and I would tell my students this, when you're looking at an 80-year-old, you are going to be that 80-year-old at some point in your life. How would you feel if someone said, well, now that you're 80, you no longer need to be among us as a society, and let's just put you again in a segregated place, or how about you don't talk anymore because you're outdated, right? So again, I want to clarify that it's important for us to have those non-judgmental, coming from a curiosity, and the intention really is to learn about this person, more than it is trying to point the finger at why are you doing this, and this is wrong and you shouldn't. And I think those are the conversations that might close the door to, or those questions might be questions that would close the door to having an open conversation. So it really is about that lead with curiosity and lead with heart and ask, you know, and again, I mean, we're bringing in other topics like, you know, a trauma-informed lens would be one that you're really being empathetic and compassionate and non-judgmental in those conversations, and being more wanting to be more of a in a learner kind of experience, right? And asking, I don't know much about how it feels to be an 80-year-old because I'm not 80 yet. Can you tell me, you know, what were your thoughts when you were 20 about 80-year-olds? You know, how has that changed? What are some experiences that you have gone through in your life that have had a really big impact on how you have developed and grown as a person? What is the biggest learning that you've had in your life at this stage? So it's really questions that help us build a better picture and understanding of who this person is and how they became who they are. More of a life story kind of conversation, starting off from when you were a younger adult, you know, to the time that this person is, or the age of that person is. And those conversations hopefully won't seem very daunting or very negative in terms of the way that the conversation is being carried, and looking more at, I want to learn from you and your experiences, and get an idea of how your journey has looked like. And I would always tell, so for example, my students at university, if you're talking to an older adult, ask them questions that you don't mind being asked yourself, you know, so always think about it from that respectful kind of conversation thing. And in fact, we do actually have guest speakers coming in from 2 different communities in Calgary to visit the class at Mount Royal, and the students have already prepared questions to ask them. And looking at the questions, they're brilliant. And the students are emailing me with feedback about how grateful they are to have an opportunity like this, to sit down with older adults and actually ask questions, because they are curious, but they're at the same time afraid of coming across as disrespectful and rude, because again, we don't prepare our younger people to have those conversations. And so when you don't know and you're not taught or educated and informed, then you tend to avoid, but continue to build stereotypes that are incorrect and not have them corrected.
Right. And so letting curiosity and heart lead, I think, is a great policy in general, in terms of dealing with any human being, and to really be asking questions, to be curious about what's going on. Let's talk about people who specifically want to see if someone is being mistreated. What are some questions to ask that may not be, you know, leading or putting things in their head or whatever, but that is a really good way of objectively trying to identify mistreatment? What are some ways to diagnose or understand what's going on?
Yeah, I get asked that question, especially from frontline workers who have clients who are older adults, and they have some form of concern about them, right? How can I ask this question without seeming that I'm, again, like you said, you know, putting this thing in their head or thought in their head, maybe it's not happening, and how can I still lead with curiosity and not be judgmental, right? Or to put them off from actually trusting me to come back and having continued conversations, because that's what we don't want. If a person might be experiencing or is vulnerable to experiencing elder abuse, we don't want to scare them off, or put them off in a way where they don't come back to us, because we might be the only eyes that are on them to ensure that they are safe and protected. And so I would say things like, you know, you can ask them questions like, tell me about your day. What did you do this week? Did you do anything exciting this weekend? Or if they are ethnocultural, for example, to ask them, what is your favorite meal to cook? Have you had the opportunity to cook that particular meal here? Those sort of questions will get you to, again, as a professional, you will be hopefully more in tune with the subtle things. And I would always tell staff that I'm training, it's not the words that your client is saying, it's how they're saying those words. It's almost like reading between the lines, because they might be afraid or embarrassed to tell you that they're being mistreated. And especially if they have the perpetrator with them, for example, who is working as the translator or the interpreter. So to ask questions like that, if they say, for example, I enjoy this particular meal, and the last time I cooked it, or the last time I had it was 3 years ago, then maybe there's something in there that is telling you that this person isn't being provided with particular necessities and needs of theirs. Or maybe, for example, oh, I didn't go anywhere on the weekend because I was babysitting my grandkids. Then maybe you can probe more about and saying, well, do you always babysit your grandkids? How often do you babysit them? How many grandkids do you have, right? So you're trying to also steer the conversation away from making them feel uncomfortable about that. The hope is, however, though, before you even enter those conversations, is you've already built rapport and trust with your client in order for them to open up to you and have those conversations. Or for example, they might say things like, oh, I've got 5 grandkids. I'm like, wow, you must be a busy and proud grandparent. Do your grandkids, for example, you can ask, do your grandkids do any extracurricular activities? They might say yes. Oh, what kind of activities? And they might say something about, they do soccer, they might do basketball. Oh, 5 grandkids, that must be really expensive. So they might say something about, for example, oh, I pay for those extracurricular activities. Then that's probably a little red flag to say, is this older adult being financially taken advantage of? Now, I also want to point out that from an ethnocultural perspective, some grandparents from ethnocultural communities, they feel it is their responsibility as grandparents to provide financially for their grandchildren or adult children themselves. So this grandparent might be willingly wanting to financially provide. So it's important not to jump into conclusions, but again, look at other things like, do they look unkept? Do they look unhealthy? They're not being fed. Because if they are financially capable and are providing financial assistance to their grandchildren, but they themselves look like they're struggling, then that might be a red flag, right? So again, it's very important not to jump into conclusions and get a feel of what the bigger picture looks like.
Interesting, because that's way more subtle than I would ever be. I tend not to be very subtle. I tend to be more direct. Is there, like, for instance, when dealing with my mom, I would tend to ask her things like, is there anything bothering you? Or do you have any concerns? Or how are you feeling physically? Do you have any, pain or owies or anything like that? One of the other ways that I found out that they left her in wet diapers is she when I asked her that, she said, yeah, my bum hurts. And she had a huge rash.
Yeah.
The diaper rash. And so had I not asked her how she was feeling physically, I wouldn't have known about the rash, which was part of what, also led me to the conclusion that they were leaving her in wet stuff. So is that, especially with people that we're close to, is that okay? Is there a better way to approach that? How do we do that again, so we're not creating problems, but really just being with them and understanding what's going on?
I mean, those questions that you had asked your mother, for example, are appropriate questions. And especially, like you said, you have a relationship with her already. So if that relationship between family members, it has already been established, then some of these questions might be okay. Again, the aim here is to, from a professional perspective, is to ensure that you're being respectful in the way that you're asking these questions. So if I don't have a relationship, of course, with your mother, for example, that I would say things like, so how are you doing today and how are you feeling? Is there anything that I could help you with? Is there anything that's bothering you? Is there a way where we could make your day even better today, right? So those subtle questions can bring upon the conversation of, the physical discomfort, et cetera, et cetera. Those questions, like I mentioned, you need to ensure that they're respectful, that they don't cross boundaries, and they don't come across as being questions that put in fear or distrust, because then you won't have that person come back to you and open up to you. So you want to make sure that the door is always open, right? So if you feel like, and again, I would say to the staff members that I would train, you have to pay attention to not just the words that are being said, but how they're being said, and other things like body language, for example. Do they seem to not want to talk about this particular? Do they seem to lower their gaze, for example, when you are asking them a particular question about a particular person, for example, right? So having those subtle signs, part of your holistic understanding of what this person is going through, and believing them. Really, it's just believing what they have to say, but being an investigator at the same time. So some questions could be asked directly, especially if you've had that relationship with them, or if they seem to be open about having those conversations. Other questions might need to be a bit more subtle and a lot more respectful, and a lot more boundary kind of brought in as a result of you hopefully gradually building that trust with that person. And again, it could be things that you are, from your lens, seeing as abusive, yet they, from their lens, are not seeing it as abusive. So it's very important to see where you could meet. And just to clarify that, it's great that you're helping your grandkids and your adult children with paying the bills or the groceries, or your grandchildren's extracurricular activities, but I really am worried about you, and I want to make sure that you still have enough money to look after yourself and meet your own needs. So can we make sure that you don't forget yourself, right? Again, in a very compassionate, very empathetic, very human to human kind of conversation, coming from the intention of that the intent here is that you're worried and concerned.
Oh, that's a very, I love the compassion and the gentleness with which you approach these things as well. Let's just finish up with some what we can do. So advocacy or intervention or remedying situations, what are some actions people can take? So practical on the court. So let's start with, if you're a professional dealing with people, what are some of the steps that you should take if you suspect abuse or mistreatment?
I would actually really just clarify the importance of education and awareness. Now, there are always these two aspects, and I had a conversation with an ethnocultural community before that said to educate and bring awareness is almost like assuming that we can change minds, and sometimes we can't. However, to understand what their specific needs are means that you're meeting them where they are in order for them to be ready to receive the support that you're trying to provide them. It's always about when they are ready, when your client, when the person is ready to reach out to you, but to leave that door open to them. We would have situations in which, for example, you might have a client that isn't ready to report that their adult child is abusing them, because that in itself, that report, calling 911 or the non-emergency police line, for example, would open a file. In that case, you tend to be worried about the consequences of that. But to ensure that they at least have the contacts, the resources, the phone numbers, when they are ready to use them, when they are ready to contact you, you'll be there. You'll be there to support them and advocate for them. As long as you always have to also keep in mind that your person has to always have the control and the ability to be independent in the decision-making process, that we're not pushing them to make those decisions, right? Because it could backfire on us. So advocacy, training, education, spreading the word about how important it is to have those kind of conversations, and inviting individuals from various agencies and levels within our society to have those conversations, and admitting the fact that it is a conversation that is hard to have and sensitive, but it is important to have in order for us to really do well to those individuals in our society who might need a voice and might need us to advocate for them.
So what I'm really hearing and taking away from that is, whether you're a professional working in a seniors facility, or you're a coach or someone who's working with people in some capacity, or an adult child of an older person, or a family member, really letting them know, here's what resources are available to you. Here's what here's what I see. Here's what we've discussed. Here's some resources to support you. Here are some options. I support you in your choices, and I'm here for you. to not push, to not have your own agenda, to give them the options and the education and the resources and the avenues they can take, but to not take the step for them, which is again doing that in turning them into children and making choices for them and just taking away their power, assuming they have no power, which is, it is challenging when we see people as being in you know destructive or harmful situations. Because as you were talking, I was likening it to people, women who are in abusive situations and who cannot be forced to leave. They have to make the choice at which point they'll leave. um, it's a similar thing, perhaps with even more layers as you're older. So giving them the resources, giving them the tools, letting them know you support them, that you love them, and you're there for them when they're ready is, I think, hard and powerful. It's probably the most loving thing we can do.
You don't want to take agency from individuals, right? And like you said, because we care about, and sometimes these are family members or friends, neighbors, people we love, we want to do what we think is best for them. But we really have to consider sometimes whether or not those actions will actually protect them or put them at greater risk or harm, especially if they feel like that environment is the only environment right now that they have to live and continue to live in, right? And so never to take away agency from people. But of course, when they're in situations where it is very dangerous for them, I think maybe gently again, pushing the need to take a further step might be needed. But while you're in that still investigative, explorative kind of stage, it's important to keep the door open for the conversations to continue to be had, but also to ensure that you're still those pair of eyes that are looking at how this person is going down their path, and to make sure that you check in on them, whether it's sometimes just checking in and saying, hey, we haven't seen you in the community for a while, or there was this event that we knew that you would have loved to attend and you didn't. Is everything okay? Is there a way where next time we have this event, we can bring you and invite you over? It could be that they don't have a car and they depend on their adult child, or they can't afford to take public transportation. So how about we find what strengths exist within the community that could rally around individuals who otherwise would be isolated.
Mm. And there are more resources than we realize when we go digging. I didn't realize there was as many resources available until I needed to find them for my mom. And I do think that we can advocate as well. So, for example, the situation with the seniors home that was taking care of my mom, I sat down with the staff and the senior executive director and so forth, and basically empathized, because I know she can be very, 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 very difficult. Um, and it's not okay to do this. And if I hear about this happening again, I will report you. How can we work together? So, working on a solution collaboratively with them, but also setting some really firm boundaries about, I am watching you. This behavior is not okay professionally, and there will be consequences if you continue. Because I think sometimes we do have to really advocate for their safety and well-being. So it may be that we also have to really be courageous enough to take that action, to stand up against authority figures, to say, no, this is not okay systemically, which is not
Absolutely.
always easy and can create consequences, but that's also important in terms of advocacy.
I just want to do a final plug.
Yeah.
We do have this resource. It's 403 Seniors, and it's a free service provided for older adults, Calgarians. And it is a wealth of information. And they have outreach workers in which, when you're calling them as an older adult Calgarian, they can give you information about services available, community activities, information about filling in forms and applications, government benefits, transportation, housing needs, and all other aspects like mental health and well-being services. So we do have resources here at CARIA as well. We advocate and work with empowering our community members, including families and older adults as well. So there are definitely resources out there.
Absolutely. And part of what you need to do is like I said, dig. Calgary and in fact Alberta has a number of programs. Age Friendly Alberta is an initiative around the province to turn communities into more age friendly environments and cities or municipalities. And um, um, Alberta AAG. Um, uh, Lots of different organizations that support people in different ways, from social services through to simply supporting them as individuals to find work or to do what they need to do to take care of themselves. One of the things that you can do in most larger centers is most cities will have an information hub. In Calgary, if you phone 311, they will help you find and navigate through all of the city's resources, provincial resources. They'll give you information about what's available. Most cities have some version of that. That's a good place to start to find information. And speaking of resources and hubs, one of the ones that I've just come across recently that I highly advocate is babyboomer.org. It's a compilation of a bunch of information from, they've currently got 660 experts in a variety of topic areas that affect boomers. So babyboomer.org. And there is information on there about abuse and treatment and caregiving and various components of that, of taking care of older people. So as well as everything from that to entrepreneurship and making money as an older person, etc., which is where I want to advocate for those of you who are looking for support in either getting going in business or keeping going in business. Please do check out maturepreneur.world. What many people don't realize, and one of the biggest forms of abuse that's going on right now, is what I call the poverty epidemic. 65% of Canadians can't afford to retire. That means there's somewhere between food and housing insecurity and simply not being able to take all the trips that they want to take. And that puts them into the situation of being vulnerable and needing help. The first line of help is to be able to be self-reliant, to create revenue, to create income, and contribution, because our mental health also is equally as important in terms of being valuable and valued, because we're contributing in a way that utilizes our expertise, our wisdom, and our gifts. So please go to maturepreneurworld.world to find support in that realm. And if you suspect someone's being abused or mistreated, please do ask questions, be curious, lead with heart and curiosity. That's probably my biggest takeaway from what you've been saying, Dr. Rose, is be willing to be present, be willing to care, be willing to be open-minded. Don't come with preconceived notions, especially when it comes to other cultures or other ways of being, and to be curious in how we can support, respect, bring dignity to, and really value other people, whether they're from other cultures, other age brackets. It extends to all of it. And like you said, I think COVID did us a big gift by making us aware that we are integrally connected on a global level. The us and them is very arbitrary and very false. We are actually all one, and the sooner we get that, the better off we're going to be. So what's one last piece? Well, first of all, thank you for providing and sharing that resource. If people want to find out more about you, the work you're doing, and the supports that you have, what can they do? How can they find you?
Definitely on LinkedIn. You'll find me there very active, but also they could email me, rosej@cariacalgary.ca. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions and also support individuals who might need particular resources or just additional information. Then I am more than happy to do that as well.
Awesome. And you also speak on this topic at conferences and events as well, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so if you are looking for a really deep conversation about this, and particularly, I think the component that is often perhaps even more overlooked is the ethnocultural component of this as well. And you I have lots of expertise and experience with that as well. So bring Dr. Rose Joudi in to talk to your group, to your organization, to your association, to your elder facility. Like she said, the more education, the better off we are. So what's one last piece of advice you'd like to leave everyone with?
To check in on people. I think that's really what I'd like to see we do more of. A lot of us, especially older adults, are feeling isolated and disconnected. And now isolation has become a big problem as well globally. So I really would urge people just to check in, individuals, if they're missing, if they haven't seen them often. That might mean the world to them, and you might be the only person who really asked about and checked in on the well-being of that individual. So hopefully we can do more of that.
Thank you. Yeah, let's care more. Thank you so much. On that note, I appreciate you being here and your time spent with us. Ladies and gentlemen, listening to this, it's a tough conversation, but an important one. So please have it with your family members, with your community, with your church group, in your workplace. Be willing to be courageous and advocate and listen in your world so that this becomes a less difficult conversation and less of an issue. Thank you for your support, and please do share this episode as well. It's so important that more people are aware and brought into the conversation. Thanks for listening. Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. I'd love it if you left a comment and subscribed. And I encourage you to apply one aha from this interview right away so you can turn your wisdom into wealth and your contribution into positive change. Bye for now.